Welcome back to Underspire Gaming. Today I'm going to be talking through how do you make sure your regiments are showing up when you want them. While the mechanics seem simple at first blush, they tend to be a bit more complicated than players will give it credit for. And so I'm going to try and unpack it and help you be able to better plan when your units arrive. So first, a quick recap of how the reinforcement roles work in the last Argument of Kings. Your units are broken down into 3 weight classes: light, medium, and heavy. When you're making a reinforcement roll for a group, let's say lights, you'll take 1 dice for each regiment that's still not on the table. You won't count characters for this, and you won't count regiments that have flanking. You will then roll those dice, looking to see how many dice fall equal to or below your target value. So turn 1, you're looking for 4 or less. Then for each success, you get to pick any of the regiments that contributed dice to that roll to come onto the table. Any regiment that failed their roll will stay off the table and roll again on the next turn until they automatically arrive. For lights, that means turn 1 and 2, they're arriving on a 4 or less, and they arrive automatically turn 3. For mediums, they arrive on a 2 or less on turn 2, and a 4 or less turn 3, arriving automatically turn 4. And then heavies arrive on a 2 or less turn 3, a 4 or less turn 4, and automatically turn 5. There are also additional rules interactions that can adjust those dice rolls. So how likely is it that a unit actually arrives? That's a big question that tends to matter in this game. For my purposes, I tend to define 80% likelihood of arriving as reliable, meaning 4 to 5 games they'll arrive when you want them to show up. So if you want a regiment to reliably arrive on a 2 or less, then you realistically need 4 regiments to be contributing dice. That gives you that 80% chance that at least one of them will arrive. However, if you're only caring about the turn where it's a 4 or less, so either lights or the second round, a medium or heavy can arrive, you only need 2 regiments in the pool. So that begs the question of how many regiments should you be taking at each weight class? And a lot of that comes down to what your strategy is. If you're trying to pull off a combo, for example, if you're trying to get a Biomancer and Vanguard Clone Infiltrators on the board turn 1, you're likely going to want more regiments. So you're going to want roughly 4 regiments to make sure you're getting 2 units to get both pieces of that combo on the board. However, if you've got beefier combat units, it may not be feasible to bring additional regiments just to have them show up. In which case, you might want to consider using an alternative method, which I'll start going through to get them to arrive. The most prominent one being flank. So flank is a special rule that says instead of contributing dice to the reinforcement roll, you withhold that dice and you simply get to choose which turn that regiment arrives. It still can only arrive on a turn it would have made a roll. So mediums can only arrive turns 2, 3, or 4. Heavies can only arrive turns 3, 4, or 5. And you're still forced to automatically arrive when the rest of that weight class would. But what it lets you do is take a bigger unit and guarantee it arrives on the table. Most armies have some way of fighting this rule. Typically, it's a character taking tier 3 tactical, which provides flank. And since only one stand-in regiment needs the rule for the entire regiment to gain flank, the character carrying the rule will allow the entire regiment to flank. There are also rules that interact with the reinforcement rolls as well. And we're going to take a quick look at those so you just know what's out there. Before we ever even look into factions, the most universal example is in the organized play packs. Heavy duty will increase your target roll for heavies by 1. This means instead of a 2 or less, or a 4 or less to arrive, heavies will show up on a 3 or less or a 5 or less. 0 to hero will also increase the target for heavies, but this time by 2. So a 4 or less on turn 3 and a 5 or less on turn 4. The heavies won't arrive on a 6 or less because a 6 is still always a failure for reinforcement rolls. Now to look at how each faction can adjust their chances of arrival. Within Dwegum, you have the Holdray, whose supremacy ability, the Mountain Stands, will add +1 to the target roll for heavies, so they'll arrive on 3 less or 5 less. Additionally, the Ardent Karawa gains flank if it has tier 3 tactical retinue. The 100 Kingdoms has the Imperial Officer, whose supremacy ability is rapid deployment. So while he's on the field, everything in the army gains +1 to their target roll, so arriving on 3 or less or 5 or less. Additionally, if the Imperial Officer reaches tier 3 tactical, he also gains flank. Out of all the factions so far, Nords has the most way to interact with the reinforcement roll. The Blooded Supremacy ability, Call of the Hunt, grants flank to every unit in his warband as long as he's on the table. So if you can get him in with lights on turn 1, you can ensure that the rest of his warband will arrive when you want it. The Jarl Supremacy, on the other hand, does the exact opposite. It gives a -1 to all enemy reinforcement rolls while he's on the table. This means instead of units arriving on a 2 or less, or 4 or less, they're suddenly arriving on a 1 or less, or 3 or less, which can allow the Nords to establish a strong board presence early. The Jarl, by taking Tier 3 Tactical, can also gain flank. The Trove Find Golden Torque will grant a character flank. The Stalkers and Fenner Beast Pack regiments already have flank, and the Savage unit upgrade grants flank to its regiment, which can be taken by Ulfandar and Blade Chosen. The Old Dominion are unique in the fact they're the only faction that doesn't gain flank via the Tier 3 Tactical equivalent. Instead, Tier 3 of Regalia of the Old Dominion will grant a +1 to reinforcement rolls while the character's on the table, so 3 or less or 5 or less. The Dark Blessing Deathless Duty will grant the character's warband a +1 while they're on the table, a 3 or less or 5 or less. And before you start thinking you can combine them, Parabellum's already seen where you're going, and these two don't stack with each other. The Old Dominion does have a few ways to gain flank, the first being the Treasure of the Old Dominion Vexilia of the Lost, which will give a character flank. Additionally, the Apostate unit upgrade will grant flank to Cultists and Hashashin. And finally, the Fallen Divinity has flank, although it's typically using it to make sure it's not being shot off the table before its Dark Power Pool can charge. The Spires only have 2 ways to gain flank. The Mimetic Assassin always has flank, and the High Clone Executor, reaching Tier 3 Tactical, gains flank. For the Wadroon, there's a variety of options. The Matriarch Queen Supremacy, the Matriarch Walks, will allow you to reroll 1 dice each round as long as the Matriarch Queen is on the table. The Loyalty Mastery will give +1 to the roll for the character's warband while they're on the table, so 3 less or 5 or less. The Mastery Wasteland Adder will grant a character flank. The Matriarch Queen can obtain flank through Tier 3 of Teachings of Conquest. A Predator can gain flank through Tier 3 of Teachings of Conquest. And Tracker, a once per army unit upgrade, can grant flank to Blooded or Hunters. So each faction has several ways to help make sure units arrive. It can be as simple as just making sure you have enough regiments in that weight class, to taking more complex approaches like flank or modifiers to your roll. For those who are interested, here's an expanded odds table that covers from a 1 or less up to a 6 or less. The general synopsis is if you need a 1 or less, which can only be caused by your Jarl so far, you're unlikely to be getting a unit consistently. Meanwhile, if you can get to a 5 or less, either through a scenario or a character, you're most likely going to get at least one of your units and possibly multiple. And if you find yourself routinely cursing your dice and not being able to have regiments arrive when you need them, it might be worth stepping back and looking at your list. Do you need more regiments to make sure that heavy hitting medium arrives? Or do you maybe need to find the points to give that unit flank so you can make sure it arrives when you want it? Thank you for watching, and let me know in the comments if you'd like more of these theory-based videos or not. And like, comment, and subscribe for more Conquest videos.